that what you inherit in the first cell with which you began life, that's the same DNA in the trillions of cells in your body. And somehow that inherited DNA has shown through over the complexities of development and the complexity of biological systems. I mean, it really is astounding. The masses of twin and adoption studies began to take us from the view that nothing's heritable to realizing that everything's heritable. And we've reached a point now
Yeah.
by the 90s where the first law of behavioral genetics is everything is heritable. That is, you can't find a trait that's reliably measured that does not show substantial genetic influence. It's not just statistically significant genetic effects, which is what we have too much of in the behavioral sciences. We've got to ask about the effect size. And we're talking about, on average, half, 50% of the variance of the differences between people on all traits in psychology is due to inherited DNA differences, which is astounding because, in psychology, if
Blew
you
me away. Completely
explain
blew me away.
5% of the variance, that's really big. And, people just don't realize and that's 5%. And now you take 50% of the variance. There's nothing like it. I mean, as you were saying, you were surprised by that. Well, I think we were all
Yes.
surprised by it. You just couldn't expect that what you inherit in the first cell with which you began life, that's the same DNA in the trillions of cells in your body. And somehow that inherited DNA has shown through over the complexities of development and the complexity of biological systems. I mean, it really is astounding.
I think it's a fairly easy thing to accept in obvious cases of physical characteristics, say things
Yes.
like eye color, shoe size, height. Weight
Yes.
was a surprising one to me, but we can get to
Was,
that. But
yeah.
there's a few that I think everyone is like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But the ones that really surprised me were things like divorce,
Yeah.
probability of watching TV or your watch hours watching TV. And this
Yeah.
is in cases where the child didn't grow up in the same household as the parent and they were raised apart. And somehow there was still a correlation between things like probability of getting divorced, watching TV. Like these are physical manifestations of like, it's hard to even piece together how the DNA can have an influence on those things decades down the line. In some cases,
Yeah.
4, 5, 6 decades.
But when you understand the answer to that question, you understand a lot about the way genetics works. So you take something like I published that first study on genetic influence on television viewing in children because it was being perverse a bit, and I knew it would get a lot of flack, which it did, but
Yeah.
it's held up. Everything's heritable. And part of the problem with divorce and especially TV viewing, TV viewing has been used in thousands of studies as an environmental measure. How much TV do kids watch? What kind of TV do they watch? That's the environment, that's the TV out there and the kids watch it and it affects them. It affects their adjustment or whatever. But we say the question I'd like everybody to always ask is, yeah, but what about genetics? So if you think about it, you you know parents don't make their kids sit in front of television. I mean, increasingly they make them not sit in front of television, but the kids watch what they want to watch to some extent. And increasingly now, where a lot of kids have their laptop in their room and they watch television as they wish, it and and so it's not just a matter of the environment being forced on you. A lot more of the environment is the experience of selecting, choosing to watch TV or not instead of playing football, or modifying the environment. You sort of watch TV in the background as noise, but you're really doing something else. And then actually actively seeking your environments. That's the way genes work. It's not like they're hardwired. That I knew what was going to happen when I published that article in the 80s about genetics of TV. There were going to be newspaper stories, the gene for watching television, do you know?
Yeah.
And, it makes you bang
Yeah.
your head. But I have learned that a little bit more sympathy for journalists because they don't have much control over who writes these strap lines, which are meant
Catchier. It's going to
to
get
get
more
clicks.
clicks.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah.
and with divorce, we could use that as a little quiz for the audience. So with television viewing, it's substantially heritable, maybe 40% heritable. We found that in twin studies. We find it in adoption studies, where, as you said, the amount of television that adopted children watch is much more correlated with the amount of television their birth parent, whom they never saw after the first year of life, watches. So it is mind-boggling, but I hope people can see how that can happen because, people are different. They have different interests. And so let's think about divorce now and say, that's kind of used as a prototypical environmental measure. But then anybody who's been divorced, and I've been divorced twice, it's not something that happens to you. You're not just walking along and somehow divorce comes up and you get hit by divorce. It's a relationship, and relationships change as people change. You can see that when you say that, I hope it's clear that there could be personality characteristics involved in that. That the divorce isn't an event, it's an experience, and it's an experience in which we're involved. It doesn't just happen to us. And this is true of
Yeah.
all the environmental measures, like the ones that are used the most are life stress measures. And, again, these are, because they're called environmental measures, people say, oh, well, that's the environment. And we think of the environment as out there affecting us, but that's not the way the psychological environment works. It has to do with experience. And that's where the genetics comes in. So the big items, the top items on life stress events scales are things like having financial trouble, getting in conflicts with people. Well, you can see that isn't the environment out there. That's you interacting with your environment. And the you of it is where the genetics comes in. Some people are just a
Yeah.
lot more irascible and they're going to have more conflicts with people. And, it's just personality. And the neat thing about divorce is there was a study showing, an adoption study in Minnesota, that showed that the characteristics that might make you an attractive partner in a relationship might be the same characteristics that make you more at risk for divorce. And by that, I mean things like, I made this mistake early in my love life with, as an adolescent. Girls who are wild and crazy, and want to do wild
Yeah.
things, they're fun to be with, but
They
then
are. Absolutely.
um,
Yeah.
that can be dangerous for day-to-day living and decade-to-decade living, So
Yeah.
um, it's interesting that the very things that might make you genetically influence things that make you attractive might also be the things that make you more liable for divorce.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. But I think the real struggle that people have with this, or the real struggle I at least had with this, is that they don't attribute their personality and their psychological traits to their genetics, to their DNA. I think that they mostly attribute it to their experiences, to the fact that they overcame their struggle when they were 5, and they tripped at the start of the race and they caught back up, and whatever experiences people go through in life. I think most people think that those events are what shaped them into who they are today.
Yep.
I mean,
Yep.
wrongly it seems by the data.
But fair enough. I mean, environmental hypotheses are always reasonable, but
Yeah.
they're basically wrong if you don't think genetic influence is important. And that is, a real important thing for understanding yourselves. And then as you get to be a parent, for understanding your children, it's just so important to recognize they're 50% similar to you, but that means they're 50% different. And what you find as a parent, there's this famous aphorism that parents are environmentalists until they have more than one child. So that with the first child, say she's very shy, you ask parents who have a shy child, why are you shy? Why is your child shy? And they give you one of two answers. That's every time. It's either I took her out too much when she was young, or we didn't take her out very much when she was young. You see,
Yeah.
opposing hypotheses, but after the fact, they're reasonable. But then when you have a second child and that child's 50% different from the first child and from you, you're likely to have a child who's much less shy because, so then you see these differences between your kids early in life and you say, I didn't do that. These kids
Yeah.
came with some differences. So that's why they say parents are environmentalists until they have more than one child. But for everyone, it's an important distinction, important thing to know, that genetics is a lot more important than you think. And okay, maybe it's hard for you to understand that personality is heritable, but it is. And psychopathology is heritable. So if you're easily depressed or you have other sorts of personality problems, rather than beating yourself up, you need to recognize that you're, given the normal wear and tear of life, you're more likely to succumb to like depression. And so you need to think about that and say it's not that you're a weak-willed person or something. It's just harder for you. The trait
Yeah.
that I really see on that is weight, and fat shaming and that sort of thing. So we can get into that later because that's part of the DNA revolution. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up though, because I think you're right. We've done surveys of people, and they think there's some uh, heritability, genetic influence on personality. But you're right, not nearly as much as, say, certainly as height. And
Yeah.
as you said, weight is surprising to people that it's quite highly heritable. But then also cognitive abilities and learning ability. When people are at school or if they're teachers, can you help but notice that some kids just learn more easily than others? It
Yeah.
doesn't take a fancy IQ test or something to figure out that some people are just a lot brighter, however you define it. They solve problems quicker. They get there faster than you. And, so I think at some level, people must recognize that their genetic influence is pretty ubiquitous. But if they don't, then they don't have to believe me, but at least keep it in the back of their minds that heritability, genetic influence, accounts for about half of the differences between people on all psychological traits. There's no psychological trait that shows zero genetic influence.
If you enjoyed that short podcast clip, then I'm so confident you will enjoy even more the full conversation. You can click it here. Click it. Come on. You know you want to. Click it.